Christians, to some, are known for their rebellion against kids playing like D&D during the Satanic Panic and not playing Doom because it has demons in it.
But are Christians not supposed to enjoy things? Are we supposed to do nothing that would be considered fun?
This episode, two guys who are Christians with lots of hobbies are going to talk about constructive ways that we as Christians can enjoy things while also seeking to glorify God in them. Welcome to the Pilgrim Song. Welcome to the Pilgrim Song, episode 21. I'm Alexander.
And I'm Charlie.
And we're your two favorite interracial friends talking about Jesus. Thank you guys again for all your listens and all your watching. We really appreciate it. And this is an episode that we've been kind of thinking about doing for a while, about talking about Christians and how we handle our hobbies and responsibilities. Because while we both work quite a bit, we still have our time to hang out and do this podcast, but also we do a lot of stuff outside of this. So today we wanted to talk a little bit about what we do just outside as Christians, how we enjoy our free time, but also how we are striving to use that in the opportunities to glorify God. So, Charlie, here we go. Opening question. Do you think that people's attitude about Christians is that we can't have fun? And why do you think that is?
Yeah, that's definitely a stigma that I've heard people say about us before, or I've heard other people talk about it, or like heard lessons on it, or people, get on a preaching soapbox about how, Christians don't have fun or something like that. So I went to a private Christian high school. I think I've talked about it before in elementary school. So like, we all did the same stuff. We all hung out together and none of it was really bad. So I wasn't really exposed to like that idea of people kind of looking down on us or thinking that, we don't get to have fun until I got to college. And then for sure. It definitely presented itself where like I would get invited to certain like parties, or I'd get invited to like, go tailgating with some of the people in my class, or get invited to just, hang out with them. And I kind of knew what was going to be going on. So, I would usually turn it down or try to come up with some excuse as to why I couldn't. And so eventually they just like quit asking because they knew that I was always going to say no. And they also knew that I was a Christian. Yeah. And so, that definitely kind of came out then, where there was that stigma, about me, around my friend group at school, where it was like, oh, he's that guy, doesn't cuss or drink or never hangs out with us. He hates us, They'd say it jokingly, but I think there was definitely some kind of seriousness behind it. So.
Yeah. I don't know exactly what it's birthed out of. Like, I know that we're supposed to be different, and there is a call to be different in Christian culture. Jesus tells us that's what we're called to be. We're going to go through a passage today that just talks explicitly about this. But there's also, like, I don't know, there's perhaps when we've done too much to emphasize this is what we don't do as Christians, and that kind of creates people's perception that you're not allowed to do anything.
Yeah, I think we've definitely done it to ourselves in some ways, where like we can come across as like, oh, I don't do that because I'm a Christian, and you're really bad for doing whatever that is. Mm-hmm. But I also think it may be some level too of, maybe they feel bad about doing it themselves. Like when they find out that we don't do certain things, then they're like, it's like when you have a friend who like, is like, a good friend or whatever, and you're trying to influence them to go do something with you that maybe isn't the best idea. And then they're like, no, I'm not going to do that because I really shouldn't be doing that. And then it makes you feel bad about it. And so then you're like, oh, you're just whatever. And you get mad at them and try to like put the blame on them or make them seem like a loser because they don't want to, even though you on the inside actually know that they're probably right in that situation. So that could be some level of it as well.
Yeah,
but,
for sure. So
yeah,
but that's a perception that we are not going to be able to shake entirely, because there are things that the world does that we just will refuse to do. We should refuse to do. But at the same level, we have fun. Like I've enjoyed my life as a Christian more, I think. One of the examples that has been used a lot is in experiments that are done, social experiments. If you have like, here's a highway or whatever, a street running, and there's cars going down it, and kids, like, if you give them all this room and no boundary at all, they're gonna stick to the playground because they don't want to run out in the street. But the second you put up a fence, they're gonna go all the way over the fence because they can enjoy, they can feel protected inside this boundary. And that's what a lot of Christian faith, I believe, is God puts up a boundary. Everything within here you can enjoy. This is good. This comes from me. But beyond that, it leads to death, like, honestly.
Yeah.
So, but that's interesting introduction to kind of what we're trying to address today. So, anything else that, any other ways that people perceive Christian faith that you're like, or I guess our relation to free time and stuff like that?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like it's about like the same types of things, that we tend to teach against, like, we don't drink or we don't smoke. Like, those are probably like the most like common things that we talk about that we don't participate in, that kind of stuff. But I think it's more than that too. I mean, there's other like bigger things or little things that we don't do that, just kind of make us in general different, even though we fixate on those two. I feel like we fixate on those two probably the most. But yeah, I mean, there's a lot of stuff that we're going to do differently, but I agree. Like, I definitely have fun in my life, and I think that I have more fun, being the way that I am because I actually have something fulfilling. Yeah. Or I feel like I have something fulfilling anyways. So yeah, for sure.
I agree with that. So let's talk about, let's give our examples. Charlie, what do you do in your free time?
Work. No, I'm just kidding. No, yeah. So that's what I always, when I wasn't like actively in class or in school, it was always, what do you do in your free time? I'm like, oh, I do school. To the point, like, funny story where one time some of my friends were being interviewed because I was getting a new position at a company. So my friends had to get interviewed for it. For one of the things that I was going to do. And one of the questions they got asked is like, what would you find Charlie doing on a typical Friday night? And every single one of them, both like friends that I had in class that got interviewed, but then also like my church friends as well, like my really good friends, they both said the same thing. And that was, oh, you'll probably just find him studying at home or like doing schoolwork. And I was just like, oof, what has my life come to? This is me. This is where I live. But no, that's not associated. I do work a lot, but that's not all I do. Whenever I try to get free time, I like to do a lot of woodworking. I like to play some instruments that I get to do. Disc golf is probably one of my biggest hobbies at the moment. My wife and I like to go on hikes together. We like to go on walks together, play board games, fun stuff like that. Other games, What about you?
Well, I do some similar things. I wish I could woodwork. I'm not the best with my hands. But I work quite a bit as well. But so while I study and stuff like that during the week, in my free time, I love TV and movies. I watch quite a bit. I'm a huge Marvel person. So Loki finishing this past week, I was watching Loki, trying to make my plans for Black Widow, of course. I think the Black Widow is probably the first Marvel movie I haven't seen in opening since probably Iron Man. Like, yeah. So I love Marvel. I grew up reading the comics, so seeing it on the big screen has been just the coolest thing for me. Yeah. Like Charlie said, we play disc golf together, and it's great. Go play some disc golf. It's fun. I like to walk. I'm trying to learn how to crochet right now. I like having the opportunity to just, like I said, I'm not very good at working with my hands, so I'm trying to get better at it. I want to have good dexterity and stuff like that, especially before I get too old and I can't do it. I used to cross stitch. My girlfriend got better than me, so I don't do it very much anymore. Hopefully I get back into it at some point. I'm trying to read more. I read my Bible, but like just in general, regular reading. I need to read more. But I also mentioned D&D in the introduction because I play D&D and I love it. I think it's really cool, but I also play a ton of board games and I love video games. And I think a lot of those things have helped me socially and with some other skills. So I've come to really appreciate video games, not just as let me turn my brain off for 8 hours, but like as a social experience, like sometimes you have a really rough day and that's a way to decompress. So I do a lot of stuff like that, but I also love sports. I watch a lot of sports and I play sports. I don't have as many opportunities as I hoped in Tuscaloosa to play soccer, because it's just it's not really a soccer place if you know what Tuscaloosa is. But it is a wonderful thing to watch teammates work together, and that's one of my favorite things. So yeah, I love a lot of things. Like I've been super blessed in my life to have parents who wanted to introduce me to a lot of these things, and then just as I've grown up, like, here's something I didn't get to try before, let me try this, and then enjoy it.
For sure.
I think that's something that's cool. But I guess a weird question kind of segueing through this is, do you think that there is something about hobbies, sports, all this type of stuff that you think God has put into humanity to like get us, I don't know, to enjoy them? I don't know.
No, I definitely think that he has. I mean, we know that there are things in life that God has given us to be able to enjoy. And you know, specifically like the one that probably comes to my mind, like just off the top, is like with music and like poetry, like a hobby that a lot of people have, like, you know, when they're playing instruments or singing or that kind of thing. Like we see that like all throughout the Bible. You know, it's probably the biggest way that we worship today is by singing hymns to God. And that's been that way since, you know, all the way back, you know, all throughout the Old Testament, they would sing praises to God, to the point where, you know, like we sing praises to God. We have examples of angels singing to God or praising him with some sort of like poetry. We have very prominent characters in the Bible, like David specifically, who was an active musician, who wrote a lot of the Psalms. He wrote a lot of poetry and a lot of songs about God and worshiping to him. And he was able to do that and have that hobby. You know, Jesus sang hymns while he was here. I know they did that.
Yeah.
After the Lord's Supper, they sang a hymn together. So, you know, we have that all throughout the Bible, and to the point where I honestly genuinely think that God enjoys music as well. Just because that's the way that we worship him so very often, and we know it's pleasing to him. So I do think God enjoys to hear that, you know, music, like, you know, so maybe God actually specifically enjoys music, and so that's why he allowed us to be able to make music, to be able to have that kind of poetic nature of ourselves and have that hobby. Maybe I'm wrong on that. I don't know. But, you know, the fact that, you know, we do it to worship him, I feel like he enjoys it.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, I definitely think that it's true that that God put these things in our lives to be able to take part in, to be able to enjoy and have other benefits come out of it as well.
Yeah. So. I totally agree. One of the things I've been considering recently, I can't remember who quoted it or said this quote exactly, but it's like, we have all these land animals on the planet, but of all of them, the only one who stops and contemplates like the sunset are humans. Everyone else, like everything else is like, well, they react to the sun and like they do things based upon the sun, but we're the ones who are like, let me paint that, let me like take a picture of it, and it's like, there's something about going on a hike through God's beauty, or playing an instrument, or working as a team, something that draws us into like either something just bigger than ourselves, all that type of thing. And I think that God, in a sense, dwells in the places where we find enjoyment and all the things that are truly pleasurable. Yeah,
and you could go like deep into the psychology side of it even too. Talk about things like endorphins and that kind of stuff that get released when you win a sports game, or, you know, you do something good in a hobby, or you create something really cool, or you learn to play a new song or something like that on an instrument. Like, but you go back to like, you know, well, who's the one that created us in that way? And that's God. Like he allowed us to be able to have things like, you know, endorphins that we can get released to be able to have that kind of pleasure in our life. And I'm really glad that we do get to have that.
I think so too. You could have just made us really boring and dull.
Yep.
So that's not what Christianity is. Yeah. It's pretty fun.
Sadly, that's what gets us into a lot of trouble, though. That
is true. And that's what we're going to talk about a little bit here. So hobbies are great, as we said. God has given us this pleasure and opportunities to engage in this pleasure. But hobbies can be dangerous. So we want to make sure we clarify that. And we'll be talking about that when we come back. So as we talk about hobbies and pleasure, we've talked about how they are good things. And a lot of times, a lot of circumstances, they come from God. So spending your free time doing these things is good, but hobbies can also cause some problems. I am not married yet. Charlie is married. But yeah, nice. I'm working towards it. But and neither of us has children. But we have to remember that anytime we have, as cool as hobbies can be, we have to remind ourselves that it takes a backseat to service of, like Charlie's instance, the service of his wife, later in our lives, the service of our children, because the neglect of children that a lot of times happens in this country is super frustrating. And for a Christian, like, that is not on the agenda. You are called to serve your children, serve your household with everything you have. So maybe that's just my perspective. Like, do you think that there's a household issue? Like,
yeah, for sure. I mean, like, that was honestly probably one of the biggest adjustments for me when I first got married. And I feel like it is for a lot of people, is that when you're dating, there are still times that you have time to yourself, just by yourself, that you can do, your personal hobbies, different like things that you like to do. And so when I first got married, I still would want to do a lot of those same things, but I realized that, like, between like school, which I was still in at the time when we got married, my own personal hobbies and my relationship with my wife, oftentimes the newest part of that grouping there was the relationship with my wife, and so it was easily the one that would have gotten neglected the easiest. And so it was definitely like a rearrangement of priorities that had to be done in my life in order to put that relationship first, because that's what needed to go before everything, even school, which before that was, God, of course, was probably one of the most important things to me. Hence my story earlier when I just studied all the time. But one of the cool things though that we were able to do was find stuff that we could do together. There is overindulging in hobbies and things like that when you can put those things first, but you can also use that want to do those kinds of activities to drive your relationship to get closer as well. Where Anna and I can go on walks together, go on hikes together. Anna plays disc golf, so she likes to go play with me, in that kind of sense. And there's just different things like that. Also, like when I was a kid, and I don't have kids yet, but I remember when I was young, the reason why I like woodworking specifically is because my dad was a woodworker, and so he's the one that taught me that kind of stuff. Taught me probably 95% of what I know when it comes to like working in a shop. And so we're able to have that together, and throughout our entire time together, there were things that me and my parents and my family would do together as a family, and build those fun times we were able to have those hobbies together. Where, instead of them having their own hobbies, we all had hobbies together. And so we were able to use that time to build our relationship. Yeah.
I really like what you said about that, because like, I think the human tendency is to be selfish. So it's like, this is what I do. And kind of, if you don't fit into what I want to do, you kind of get shoved to the edges. So it's important for us to, first of all, be selfless, especially in a marriage relationship. You read anything out of the Bible about marriage, it is your call to be selfless, to be like Christ in that. But also that I really resound with how my family treated hobbies and stuff like that. The reason I'm into comic books is because my dad was into comic books. I enjoy cooking because my mom enjoyed cooking. So like,
your dad plays video games.
My dad does play video games. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So a lot of those things that I grew up doing, I enjoy because it's what my family did together. So museums, hiking, all that type of stuff. So having hobbies does not mean that, if you have a family or you have a wife or anything like that, you automatically get rid of them. But it means that they need to be reprioritized. So
and some of them will have to change.
Yes, exactly. Yes. You cannot continue to do everything. So it's a lot of selflessness, and you just have to learn that, here's my responsibilities to my spouse. Here's my responsibility to my children. And also, when we talk about family, that extends to spiritual family as well. For sure. So we can have our spiritual family engage with our hobbies. We've kind of talked about that with fellowship. But there's also times that when our spiritual family needs us, that we cannot just continue to be indulging in hobbies, to their, to harm in a way that harms them. So we have to be very considerate with how we use our free time, because again, these things are good. And one of the coolest things I think about how we understand what sin is, it's that God has made something that's good, and then sin is the corruption of what God has made good. Yeah. So here is something that God has given for pleasure, and it's wonderful, but if you use it and abuse it to hurt other people or to turn your back on him or anything like that, that is sinful. So we have to have that kind of balance and that kind of understanding.
For sure.
You have any other thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, we can talk about overindulging a lot, because I think that's something that, a lot of us struggle with. Because we have things that we like to do, that we enjoy to do, that we may have to give up. If you're thinking about getting married and you have a hobby, again, another thing that I struggled with was like, I wanted to force all of my hobbies onto my wife and wanted her to do all the things that I did, but I didn't want to do any things that she did, because what she did was lame, what I did was cool. And that's like the way I thought. And that's a terrible mentality. I didn't realize that I thought that way, and then it became very apparent to me that I did once we actually got married and we spent every day together. And so, but there's also like the side of it with God as well, where, do you think our hobbies can become idols for us? Where we begin to spend too much time with that and taking away, not just from our spiritual family or our physical family, but with God. I don't know. What do you think about that?
Yeah, and that's probably the biggest draw of modern idolatry, is this idea of, I want to, like, for me, soccer, I love soccer. The leagues overseas play during church every Sunday. So if I want to watch Manchester United, I would have to skip church in order to do that. And it's like, and some people are willing to take that leap and be like, well, this is what I count as more important than God, is this game and that type of thing. So as Charlie was mentioning, overindulging is very dangerous, and we have to make sure that our priorities are in the right place. And if we are calling ourselves followers of Christ, a Christian, a God-centric, that means that he must be at the highest priority. So,
yeah. But
as we speak about overindulging, we have kind of a book almost about the entirety of it being about overindulgence, and that is over in Ecclesiastes. So in Ecclesiastes, I want to do a podcast about this one in fully, because it's just, and from my perspective, it's one of the best apologetics books that we have in the Bible, just together. But he talks the entire time about things that are vain. Here's what is worthless. Here's what's garbage. Here's what's chasing after the wind. And in chapter 2, the preacher talks about what he has. He talks about his houses and his vineyards. And he's got male slaves, female slaves. He's got wives, all this other type of stuff. All these things that are bringing him pleasure. And the reality is, it's not good. And if he has this hope in that, if I do enough things, if I work enough, if I have all these concubines, then I'm going to find pleasure. He would fill his soul with it. But then you have at the end of the chapter, verses 9 through 11, it says that he does all this hard work and it means nothing. He gained no pleasure from what he did under the sun. So does that mean that all hobbying and pleasure seeking is evil? Well, of course not. Because you have to contextualize. When he says he has no pleasure under the sun, that means he's taking God out of the picture. So his hobbies and all these wives and all this stuff that he's gotten, it is a hopeless picture, because it has none of God in it. But you bring God into that picture, that means you're going to live differently, and you're going to find a different type of joy in the pleasures that you have. So it's a book with a ton of wisdom about, here is how I centralize God in my relationships. How do I centralize God in my work? How do I centralize God in my wisdom? And that is what makes my life turn from vanity into hopeful, worthwhile. Right. How I know what my duty is. And I think that's a really important way of how we view our hobbies. Yeah,
I think that was all really, really good. And I don't really have too much to add to that. If you haven't read Ecclesiastes, highly recommend it. It's not a long read, but it's very, very good. It's honestly, it's pretty easy to read, I would say. Like, it's very easy to understand, because the writer makes it very clear, what he's doing in life and all the things that he's tried to seek.
Yeah, of all the wisdom literature that we have in the Bible, I think Ecclesiastes is probably the easiest one to read.
For sure.
12 chapters, it will change your life. So
for sure.
So we want to make it clear again that we think that hobbies are good and that they're pleasurable and that God has given them for a reason. But as we've warned about, overindulgence is bad. Neglecting your responsibilities to your family, whether that be your spouse, your children, or your spiritual family, also a negative thing. And hobbies should be reserved to when you have free time. And then we're going to point to, at the end of this, ultimately in every hobby, we're called on to glorify God.
Yep.
And that is what our duty is. That's what our call is.
Yeah.
So anything else you have to say on that?
I do
Any
not.
thoughts? All right. So this is going to be our lead into our last section. We're going to talk about that when we come back. Types of hobbies can we enjoy? I want to consider this from a little bit of a couple of different angles, but mainly because there are temptations that are everywhere. And a passage that I kind of want to bring our attention into how our hobbies should be focused, it comes out of Colossians chapter 3. So Colossians chapter 3, starting at verse 12. It says, "Put on then, as God's chosen ones, holy and beloved, compassionate hearts, kindness, humility, meekness, and patience, bearing with one another, and if one has complaint against another, forgiving each other. As the Lord has forgiven you, so you must forgive. And above all these, put on love, which binds everything together in perfect harmony, and let the peace of Christ rule in your hearts, to which indeed you are called in one body, and be thankful. Let the word of Christ dwell in you richly, teaching and admonishing one another in all wisdom, singing psalms and hymns and spiritual songs, with thankfulness in your hearts to God. And whatever you do in word or deed, do everything in the name of the Lord Jesus, giving thanks to God the Father through him." So, Paul is, talking about what the Christian life looks like. How do we tie everything together? And the final thing he mentions in verse 17 is literally everything that you are doing, you're supposed to do it for the glory of God. So that really contextualizes all of our hobbies, all of our responsibilities, what we should be thinking about and focusing on when we're participating in them. So do you have any other thoughts on that Colossians 3 passage?
I mean, when you think about like what hobbies can we do, there's really, I wouldn't say, I mean, there's a short list, obviously, of a few things that I would say are sinful that we should not do, like drunkenness, for instance, is an example. But outside that, there's nothing that I would say is necessarily like off limits. Like, you can't go play disc golf because that's like in the Bible. There's not really like a specific things that we really have in the scripture that would be like hard nosed on, other than if it's a sinful thing that you're trying to participate in. But yeah, it's really about your attitude about that hobby. And like we've been talking about, like where it falls in your list of priorities. And looking at those hobbies, things that you participate in, and asking yourself, like, can I glorify God somehow in doing this? And then that's what you should do.
Yeah, exactly.
We just read about.
So those types of things are supposed to make us meditate on, this is who I'm trying to be. I'm trying to be more like Christ. I'm trying to give glory to God. That's going to affect what we do. So like Charlie just mentioned, if it's something like drunkenness, that's overtly sinful. Like, that's not even really on the radar. But there are other things where it's a gray area. Like, we don't have an exact, this is where God says X and Y and Z. Right. He doesn't say you can't watch this movie. But there are some that are obviously not helpful for people.
For sure.
That they won't be helpful in you. And you mentioned when we were thinking about this, not helpful for you either. So it's not just that you could trip somebody else up, but like your soul will be affected and become more callous based upon things you watch. But thankfully, there's a lot of new technology that's out there that helps with this. So just as things have that's part of the movie industry, is they've always been perverted and perverse. But with this new technology keep getting up, there's ClearPlay and there's VidAngel. So there's ways that you can clean out pieces of a movie that you just may enjoy, but it has a lot of that messed up stuff, and especially helps with kids too. So
for sure.
Do you use VidAngel?
Yeah. My wife and I use VidAngel a good bit, a lot, and obviously there's like the big stuff like sexual things and shows and things like that we block out. But there's also like little things too that we also try to like block out, just certain words, just different things like that. And, you know, I don't want to be exposed to a lot because it could become a temptation for me to say that, you know, in different moments when I know I shouldn't. So
yeah, exactly. And you're going to have to evaluate your strengths and weaknesses. Maybe there is something that you feel stronger, but you have to be very aware. Am I just trying to tiptoe as close to as I can to sin? Or am I, you know, again, trying to glorify God in what I'm doing?
For sure.
We have to take that very seriously. So those are like the obvious ones that we talk about. Like there's sex and drugs and using bad language and stuff like that in movies. And those are the things where like, of course, that's wrong. We don't want to encourage that type of behavior and that type of activity. But one thing that, especially for me, as someone who's enjoyed sports and enjoyed a lot of these activities, it's been really easy for me that if I'm watching, let's say for instance, when I was watching the Cubs win the World Series, somebody in my room was telling me that it wasn't a big deal. And in my anger, I threw a stool across the room. Now, as frustrating as it was that the person said something very unkind, I was not glorifying God in my attitude about the situation. So sometimes you need to take a break. And as big an event as the Cubs winning the World Series was, it doesn't mean that I compromise on what God has commanded me to be, the type of meditation and type of attitude. So whether that be watching a sport or getting really engaged in something or playing, especially because then you get your adrenaline going and all that stuff.
Right.
Everybody remembers where they were when Richard Sherman went on his crazy rant after they beat the 49ers and he was yelling at people.
He's the best corner in the game.
He's the best corner in the game. But like, you know, I think if he would go back and have that moment over again, he would do it a bit differently. But when you're high on that adrenaline and you're just going, you're going crazy, you're going to fall back on what comes out of your heart.
Right.
So when you're in the heat of the moment, in a sport or whatever, what's going to come out is what you're reflecting on. What you're reflecting on, are you trying to be a good sport? Are you trying to glorify God in that? Or is your heart corrupt and you're going to say corrupt things?
Right.
So those are things to consider.
Yeah, no, I agree for sure. Because like, you know, like you were talking about with like getting intense in sports, stuff like that. Like I have a pretty big temper and I get very emotional and I get very invested in certain things. Like, you know, you with the Cubs, I don't like Chicago, but you know, you do. So, but there are certain things that I can't watch that I have to turn off because I know that that's going to be a temptation for me to act out and lash out in ways that are very unglorifying to God. And, you know, will be very offensive to people that are around me. And I should not act that way. So I have to take those things out. So like if that's you, if you're like watching sports, that's cool. But if you're also like me and you get very emotionally invested in those, and that can lead you to do things that are very non-Christian like or act in ways that aren't how you should be acting, I'd recommend, you know, if it's, you got to turn it off in certain situations and just go do something else, as hard as that can be, that may be what you need to do. That's what I have to do for sure.
And like just contextualize what you're about to do. Like this hour-long sports event, that's going to have a little bit of an effect. But that mean word that you say to your spouse or someone else, that could have a lasting impact on them for a long time.
The way that you act in front of your kids.
Yeah.
You know, for sure. Like that's a learned behavior. How emotionally invested and stuff like that I get in that is because, you know, I've seen other people in my life act that way about those situations. And so,
and there's a right time and a place, and it's totally fine to get excited. We're not trying to discourage that, but it's just make sure that you are not using that as a crutch to like treat people unkindly and stuff like that, which can be really easy to do. So I think that's something that's affected both of us. Like I remember specifically a look someone gave me when I was yelling at my team. And that's stuck with me a lot, and it's made me think about how I enjoy, like I should enjoy this, but I should be more encouraging. And sometimes that's what my attitude was. I'm just going to break people down because they aren't doing what I'm telling them to do. So just it's a learning experience. Enjoy things, but make sure that God is glorified in everything that you do. So to kind of wrap all this up, the thought that comes out of Colossians 3 is this belonging to Christ. So when you belong to him, you're supposed to be kind. You're supposed to be humble. You're supposed to really be focused on this attitude, strengthening, encouraging, all of that. So we should be using the opportunities that we are given to esteem Christ. We talked a little bit about hiking earlier. And hiking is an awesome chance that if you're with friends, if you're with your kids, that you can go out and be like, look at this incredible thing that God has created. Look at this wilderness that God has just brought us to, and we can go and look. And those are memories that can be made, and we can teach from them. And even like for me, I see a lot of like Bible imagery type stuff that happens in Marvel superhero movies, even like Rey and the Last Dragon, if you haven't seen on Disney Plus. Like the idea of forgiveness and grace, those are not world concepts. Those are biblical concepts. So to see that played out there, I think that's super helpful to tell your friends about or to tell your kids about. And it's like, here's how I can reflect on something that's worldly, but ultimately for God's glory. Here's what I learned about God in this. And that's a good way to have your hobbies actually have an influence on your spiritual life, so that when you're meditating on what God is doing through this, that can have some that has some beneficial things. So any other thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, I think those are all really, really good points. And certain hobbies, again, like hiking, I really liked the point that you brought out where you can look around and use that as a moment to, you talked about meditating, like use that as a moment to meditate on God's creation, the beauty that's around you. And I think that's definitely one good thing that you can do to glorify God. But I think there's like another example as well, is like you and I have talked about, we both play disc golf. And so in disc golf, the community of disc golf is growing, it's getting big, and it's also like pretty close where it's a chance to be able to meet a lot of people in that hobby. And so that right there gives you an opportunity to talk to people from different backgrounds, who believe different things, believe different, worship in different ways, all kinds of different things that you can do and conversations that you can have that could potentially lead you to being able to, bring somebody who maybe doesn't know about Jesus to Jesus and be able to use that as an opportunity as well. Yeah. Where you yourself can improve your own faith and being able to look out and see different things like God's creation around you. You can also use those opportunities to meet people to increase their faith as well and to be an encouragement to other people too.
I think that's an excellent thought, where you bring it to evangelism. Like, some people need Jesus. And I mean, nature is probably one of the best things for that. I remember telling you when the rover came back and we had all those images of the sky over Mars, and it was just like, the God who created all of that cares about me. And that blew my mind, and that should blow a lot of people's minds. And maybe they haven't been cared for. Let them know there's a God who cares for them. And I think that's a good way to do that. So as you begin your Monday morning with this podcast, something that we would like you to consider is how you are spending your free time. And if that's in a hobby, good. Make sure that you're doing it for God's glory. But also make sure that if you are participating in a hobby, you are not doing it to the neglect of your responsibilities, whether that be to your spouse, your kids, your spiritual family, anything like that. So, as we often talk about on this podcast, Christianity is far more than a Sunday thing. So, we have to make it and live that way, and we have to make sure that God is given the glory in whatever we do. So that's our goal with this podcast, and we hope that as you think about your hobbies, just go and enjoy them. Like, God wants you to have that type of pleasure, but make sure you are doing it for His glory, and you're not doing something like, of course, overtly sinful. So that's our podcast for this week. Any other things to say, Charlie?
Thank y'all very much for listening.
Of course, thank y'all for listening. We hope you guys have a blessed week. Hope you think about your hobbies. Hope you meditate on how you can glorify God this week, and we will see you next week.